Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Hello.
Hello.
I'm waiting for just a couple more, maybe a minute or so to get folks in and situated. In the meantime, if you all wouldn't mind adding your institution name to your Zoom name. I'm pointing at the corner up here. There's little dots that you can change your name for us. That just helps us get a little bit of a sense of who you are, where you're from. And I will do some very brief introductions just in another minute or so before we get started. We're so excited to have you here today, talk about emergency aid. Those of you who are joining us, we're just getting situated. If you could add your institution name to your Zoom name, just so we know who you are. And I'll get us started here. My name is Angelina Ekman. I'm an Education and Training Services Specialist at the Hope Center. I'm so excited to be here with you today. I mostly do sort of program management of this work. I'm your gal for questions or anything of that nature. And I will introduce someone who probably needs very little introduction here, Sarah Golderbrog, our president and founder. Sarah, if you want to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, great to be here with all of you today. I'm delighted to support my team in this work with all of you, and I'll be bringing to bear today some work that I've been doing over the last 20 years around the strategic implementation of emergency aid, and really help us dig in a little bit, recognizing that this is a particularly challenging time and a really important time for this tool to try to help all of you as you think through your processes and practices and try to address students' basic needs and also help you to get them to graduation. So excited to do this with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. We are just going to kind of dive right in with a little bit of a warm up to get us thinking about this work. So I'm going to put something, I believe, in the chat here, Mentimeter. You can use that app, or you can go to menti.com and put in a code, and I will share my screen so you can see it in a second, but there it is. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep. Thank you so much, Angelina. Really appreciate it. So yeah, like Angelina said, just want to make sure that everybody is able to get to menti.com and to enter the code. I'm going to be using this approach today to help so that I can hear from you, both in terms of this initial exercise, and then as we move through, I've put some information for you into slides. You will get these slides when this is over, along with a slew of additional resources. And then you're also going to be able to popcorn questions in through this app here today. Okay. As I move through, I know that we have limited time. You are all incredibly busy people. I have done my best to try to tailor a set of information based on the feedback that you provided in advance, plus things that we have heard from the Texas Student Success Center and coaches and other folks. But I also want to make sure that you know that we totally understand we won't cover absolutely everything of interest today. And so our doors are open. Your coaches are going to be able to provide you additional support, and we will be sharing more resources. Okay, so let's get started. I want you to think about the last time that you were short on cash for a bill. And I recognize that for some of you that might be really recently, and for some of you it might have been a really long time ago. And I will say, if you've never had this experience, then first of all, I'm thrilled for you. That's what we want for everybody. But in that case, try to practice that mindset, or try it on, maybe thinking about somebody else in your life who might have had that experience. Okay, so you're thinking about the time you were short on cash for a bill. Angelina, can you go to the next slide for me? So this is what I would like you to do, is to think about who helped you and to provide that answer on Mentimeter for me. And let's see what y'all come up with. Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a bunch of parents. We've got a bunch of different kinds of family members. We have a few of you who said that no one helped you. You were very much alone. And then one person says the bank. One person says they had no resources to draw from. Okay, so this is pretty typical. And Angelina, if you'll just scan down for me, you'll be able to kind of see, yep, so you can see them coming in here. So this is pretty typical. You know, a large fraction of people, including your own students, hope to be able to turn to folks like parents, but there's also a sizable fraction who simply don't have anyone to turn to. And we see this not only among today's college students, but frankly, we see this nationwide. There are very sizable numbers of people, upwards of a third and possibly more, who say that if they were faced with an unexpected expense of $500, they simply would not be able to cover it. But the most important thing that we do when we need help is that we tend to turn to our social networks. And the question is, what happens when that is not possible? Next slide. So when that happened for you, when you faced that, how long did it take until help arrived? If it didn't ever arrive, then go ahead and skip the question, okay? But how long did it take? And I want you to think back as you put in your numbers here, how fast it happened for you or how slow it happened. I want you to think about what that felt like as well. Just the waiting. Okay, so I've got answers here from about a dozen of you. Thank you so much. Just going to let it tick up a little bit, see what a couple more people, see what that adds to the mix. Okay, it looks like, and welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We're glad that you're here. We're thinking about a time when you personally experienced a shortage of funds for a bill and what happened to you next and how long did it take until help arrived. And what we can see here is that most of you, about half of you, really got help pretty quickly, and by which you mean in terms of hours. It was just a matter of hours, and for some it was a day or two. Versus another half of you, it took many days, and for one of you, it took weeks. Okay, one of the most important parts of the practice of emergency aid has to do with time. And that in many ways makes it very, very different from standard financial aid, which is really primarily constructed around eligibility and the completion of forms. And then there's sort of a standard time of the year when it comes or it doesn't come. One of the hardest parts of emergency aid is that the time itself is variable, both when the incident happens and in how fast support is delivered. Go ahead and go to the next one for us. Thank you, Angelina. Okay. So first major insight from research today that I want to make sure that you take with you is that even during this pandemic, and we have a lot of updated data during this pandemic, we find that the vast majority of students who need this kind of program, who need this kind of support, are still not getting it. And that might surprise you because during the pandemic, we have seen such an increase in the number of dollars being distributed. Even with more dollars flowing through the system, we are finding the majority are still not getting help. When we say what kind of help we're talking about here, we're talking about fast, flexible, relatively small grants. I put that relatively small term there for a reason, because to some folks, $200 is a small grant. To some folks, $1,000 is a small grant. To others, it's big, right? To others, it makes a huge amount of difference. But what we're really saying is these are much smaller amounts of aid than things like the Pell Grant, right? Which are distributed through a very different kind of process. When we say that most people dealing with basic needs and security don't get emergency aid, and we estimate that's about 85% of them, I want you to also know that that is disproportionately happening for students of color, for first-generation students, and for those from low-income families. In other words, exactly the people with the highest amount of need are the least likely to actually get the support. Next slide. So I want you to think about those findings from research. People with need not getting help. Not getting help the way that you did get help. when you needed help? What are the barriers? What are you seeing on your campuses? What are you thinking about? Good. This is a great starting point. So many of you are listing things that are about information. One of you actually said information, right? So if we start to categorize these, you'll see the information pieces include not knowing who to ask, not knowing about available aid, not knowing exactly where to go, not knowing how to communicate about it. And then there's another category of things up here that are about feelings, right? They're also about the drama that can be involved in emergency aid. I want you to think about, your emergency aid program. What's the drama quotient of that program? How much do students have to go through feelings, whether feelings of uncertainty or stigma? How much do your staff members have to go through feelings of not having enough resources to provide, of the trauma of staring down someone in need who you cannot help? What is that drama quotient? And then if you scroll back up to the top there, Angelina, I noticed there's this real question about process and time, which can be related to information. Not only information on the part of the student, do they know where to go or what to do? But do you all have all the information that you need? Right? So do you know all the rules and regulations of emergency aid? Not just the federal ones, but the rules and norms at your own institutions. Do you know what's considered ethical or acceptable practice? Do you know what students really want? And then the last thing I see named in here is stuff related to assumptions, right? The stories that we tell ourselves. Stories about who deserves help. Stories about what does it mean if you get help, right? That question of pride. Stories that we tell ourselves about whether or not we're going to be eligible. A lot of students create these stories in their heads. They see a piece of communication from you. And in that stressed out condition that they find themselves in, with all that's going on in their heads, they invent whole narratives about whether or not you even want to help them. Could have nothing to do with what your intentions are. So I think what's really important here, as you look at your responses and the ways that you showed up in these data, you are representing a variety of different kinds of barriers. Different kinds of barriers that could lead us to have very well-intentioned but very ineffective emergency aid programs. Right? There are some people I talk to out there and I say, you would not believe how tough it is to distribute emergency aid well. And they're like, why is this hard? This should be really simple. And what that tells me is they've never actually done it. Or if they have, they might have done it for a few people. I know that I used to think that way when I was just a professor and I was just trying to help the students in my classroom. It became a much more complicated thing when I was stewarding funds for a nonprofit and trying to help hundreds of students at a time. And it's a whole other thing when you all are faced with a global pandemic and you need to help thousands of students at a time. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Angelina. I promise we'll share this back with you, including the results, so that you can take it and look at it later. So this is a categorization developed from our survey work about what keeps students from emergency aid. And I've listed these things really based on how students in surveys describe the challenges in the order in which they describe them. The number one reason why students don't get emergency aid is they don't know about the program. Really want you to think about that for a second. The number one reason they don't get help is they just don't even know you have anything. Notice that the number one reason is not that they're embarrassed. They don't know it exists. Number two, they don't know if they're eligible. That can mean a lot of different things. That can mean everything from, oh, I think it's for full-time students, but maybe it's not. Or do I have the grades to get it? Or is it a problem if I'm undocumented? Or, you know, my parents look like they have a lot of money and the FAFSA doesn't give me any help. So do I get help here? Right? It can take so many different forms. Number three, they don't know how to apply. And that doesn't always mean they don't know where the website is. But maybe the website asks them to fill something out and they don't know the answer to the questions. The fourth issue on there is actually really complicated. And I think that sometimes we think of that fourth issue, I think other students need it more, as if that's stigma. But in talking to students, it really does not appear to be about stigma. It's more about the perception that if they take your emergency aid, it's keeping it from somebody else who might need it more. Where does that come from? I want you to think about that for a second. I'd love to hear from maybe one or two of you if you want to put a hand up or just jump in. Where does this idea come from? That, you know, if I think I need emergency aid and then I think about Angelina and I think, uh-oh, you know, maybe Angelina is in even worse shape than me. Maybe I shouldn't even apply for emergency aid. Like, where are we getting these ideas? Any thoughts? Have you ever talked to a student who said something like that? Have you ever personally felt that? You're a quiet bunch today. That's okay. You'll jump in later. So, you know, one of the places that this can come from is this idea that there are scarce resources, right? That students are kind of accustomed to being told no. That even if it isn't about your institutions, maybe your institution has never told your students no. Maybe they always get yes from you. But yes, so Elizabeth, you said maybe they mirror the rules for discretionary funds or FAFSA, first come, first serve for state grants, right? So maybe they've applied for something before it looked like they were qualified for, only to be told you were out of money. And Shanti, I really appreciate this comment from Grayson. This is terrific. From a young age, many are taught to take only the minimum to make sure that others have plenty. It becomes a way of thinking. There's almost a direct quote about that in my book, Paying the Price. There's a man in there who talks about the way that his father taught him that he had to share with his siblings. That even if he had, and this, I'll never forget this, and it's so relevant these days, he was taught that even if they had just one Halloween costume, there were 3 siblings, and he should share the parts of the Halloween costume so that each sibling had at least something to wear. Even though, frankly, putting it into 3 parts meant you couldn't even tell what the costume was anymore. All right, this is a sort of wonderful way of being, right? In the sense that people are being empathetic with each other and generous with each other. But it is also a mindset that unfortunately can undermine your students' own success in college. Because if they're afraid to put their hand up because they think they're taking it from someone else, then yes, exactly, as Manaz raises here, they may minimize their own situation, blaming themselves for it. This is a sort of mindset that can be handled. It can be handled many different ways. One of the ways is to give them information to let them know that if they need it, they should ask for it. That the only way to increase available resources is for them to actually make clear what they need. You know, I want you to think about that for a moment. The only way to increase available resources is for students to make clear what they really need. Is that a mindset that is currently embraced at an institution that you work at? Or are you more experienced with another mindset, which is let's not tell students about a resource because we might run out? Those are two very different mindsets. There are a few other things that students talk about as reasons why they might not get emergency aid. They can't meet the qualifications. That's different than eligibility. You might absolutely be eligible, but you can't finish the application once you started it. It can't meet those qualifications. Or maybe you couldn't literally do the paperwork. Maybe you have to provide some sort of verification. And then this is a big one. There are plenty of people who do apply for emergency aid who never actually receive the emergency aid because it takes too long for the funds to arrive. Okay. Now I want to pause for a second on that and reflect that I think, Christopher, you've shared something very important. I want to ask if you'd be willing to speak this one out loud for me.
Yeah, sure. And without politicizing the conversation too much, I think we have an entire political party that really downplays the reliability or viability of providing these types of social services. And if I happen to be a member of that political mindset, I'm going to suffer some real dissonance in entertaining the thought of availing myself of something that I would overtly deny to others.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we can think about this without even thinking about a particular party at this stage in this country, right? There is a general cultural attitude throughout, and some would argue, frankly, from the beginning, from our founding. It's in what we call the Protestant ethic. This is where I'm going to really show my sociology background, okay? There's a wonderful book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that teaches us that from the very beginning, yes, Weber, exactly, Max Weber, that teaches us from the very beginning this idea that you need to have bootstraps. And that if you have bootstraps, you ought to be able to do this yourself rather than to take this support and especially to take it from anybody else. Right? This notion of self-sufficiency, this notion of demonstrating your value by being able to claw your way out of poverty. Yes, it's also called the prosperity gospel. This is exactly right. And in fact, there's a book called The Education Gospel about how the prosperity gospel has been integrated into education. So what I hear from each of you, especially those in the chat, is some recognition that you're dealing with a culture, a broader society around your campuses. And you all know better than I do about your regional differences in this regard, right? I have no doubt that throughout Texas, this is playing out in different ways at different times for different students. But you are not helpless in the face of those narratives. The first bit of power that you can embrace is to recognize the narratives and to do exactly what you are best at as an educational institution, which is to educate. And underlying all of these results from these surveys about why students aren't getting this help, they need education. They need education in order to actually get support that will allow them to get the rest of their education. And this is what you do well. That's it, The Education Gospel by Grubb and Lazarson. That's exactly right, the late Norton Grubb. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. You can offer a reading list after this. All right, so if I boil all of those things down, the things that came from your popcorning of barriers and then the students' surveys about barriers, there are three main areas to focus on improving your emergency aid programs. And everybody has room for improvement. I have had plenty of exposure to programs that tell me we are awesome. We get money to students in 24 hours. There's no barriers, we help. But even then, I'm telling you, they're not doing it at scale and not at this kind of scale that we're talking about now. I don't think there's a program in the country that doesn't have room for improvement. So you can focus those improvements in three main areas. First, you can make it easier for people to learn about your program. I don't just mean learn that it exists, learn about how it works. Think about this. You would not go to a restaurant and eat if you had not learned that it existed and you had not learned enough information to help you get there and enough information that made you feel comfortable enough to be able to go and sit down and order off the menu. So we got to help them learn. Second, we have to help them get through whatever the application process is. We can dig into the specifics of application processes a little bit later. Maybe right now you're not using an application process, maybe you're using administrative data, but frankly, the administrative data and the use of that is just a proxy for an application. So there are still processes within that, and there's still potential barriers. And then that last really crucial issue, reduce the time it takes. What's the right amount of time? Think about somebody that you love who needs your help. How long would you want them to wait? That's the right amount of time. Next slide, please. Okay, so zoom in your own brains now. Think about the emergency aid program at your college. You may be peripherally involved, you may be very involved. Okay, you may barely know or have a perception of it. Maybe you teach at the college and you've heard about it from your students. Focus on whatever part of it makes sense for you. Next slide. So I'd like you to consider the following things. You can indicate that you either strongly agree or strongly disagree, and you can do a little range on each of these things. To what extent do you think students who need help know about your emergency aid program? To what extent do you strongly disagree or strongly agree with the idea that your application process is easy? We quickly decide who gets support. Students get help fast. Go ahead and take a moment. All right, so as you watch these come up, they're clustering around 3, which tends to happen either because you think everything is kind of math. You kind of agree, you neither agree or disagree. Maybe you don't have a lot of information. The other way that this can happen is where a bunch of you think your program is really awesome and you strongly agree with everything, and a bunch of you strongly disagree, right? So it's a bifurcated distribution and we're converging in sort of the murky middle. If we just look at the relative numbers across the lines, it certainly does look like one major area to work on would be helping students to really know that the program exists. And just it's changing a little bit as people put more stuff in. It looks like the second really big area is helping students to get help faster. And maybe the application process is not quite as big a challenge for some. Okay, but one thing that would be very interesting to look at with your coaches is the extent to which various people at your institution with differing levels of experience with the program, how do they size these things up, right? So maybe a student would say, this is not fast. But for those of you who've worked in higher ed for a while, heck, I mean, I'll tell you what, if a student here at Temple got help within 10 days, I'd say it was a miracle. Like 10 days is amazing around here for anything. We can't cut a check in 10 days typically to pay somebody who we owe a big contract, right? So 10 days looks good. So, you know, depending on where you sit at an institution, you may have differing perceptions of what fast is. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So then let's talk about that a little bit more, right? How do you measure speed for emergency aid? Not in your heart, right? Not in how you relate to another person, but you at work. If you want to know how fast is this thing, how do you really think about it? Is it hours? Is it in days? Is it in business days? Because if I surveyed you and I said, how many days does it take to distribute emergency aid? Would you be counting the weekends? Okay, based on what I see here, the overwhelming majority of you would count it in terms of business days. Now I want you to think about that a little bit. Let's go back to the beginning of this exercise when you thought about a time you didn't have money to pay the bill. When did you think about it? Did you think about it Monday through Friday? Or did you think about it at night? Did you think about it Saturday night? This is one of the most challenging areas for higher education. We have business hours for a reason, including that you are all people. You are people, and at some point, you have to stop working. But from the lived experience of people dealing with not having the money that they need, they think about it every hour. It's a constant. And so if a student steps forward at 4:30 on Friday afternoon and submits an application for emergency aid, and they get help on Wednesday, in their minds, they've counted from Friday to Saturday, from Saturday to Sunday, from Sunday to Monday, from Monday to Tuesday, from Tuesday to Wednesday, 5 days. And if you're counting business days, you've counted Monday, Tuesday, and maybe Wednesday. And those are just big differences in the actual experience. Next slide. So think about breaking those numbers down now. How quickly or how fast do each of these parts of your current program move? How long does it take someone to complete the application once they know about it? How long does it take once they've applied till you make a decision? And how long does it take from the time that you've made a decision till the money's going out the door? It's interesting to watch the shape of these distributions change too. So it looks like we've got a number of people who feel like the time it completes, the time it takes to complete the application moves really fast. I'd love to hear from a couple of you about how you're doing that. Would you be willing to share? Can anybody just speak up or raise your hand and tell us about how you're doing it so that students can really complete the application very, very quickly?
Our application is embedded on the on our website, on our college website, so students can find it easily, complete it, submit it, and it goes directly to the person that it needs to go to make the decision.
So Teresa, thank you so much for jumping in there. How many questions is on the application?
Let me see.
And while you're thinking about that, I see Molly Harris from Grayson says, the application is quick and easy as long as the student has their bills handy. What information, Molly, do they need from their bills?
Hey there. So our emergency aid program helps students cover bills. And so if they have a cell phone bill or a car, payment that they need to make, we need some sort of documentation to show that they have that outstanding balance. So if they have that handy, then they can snap a picture with their phone and upload it into that application. I know Barbara Malone does our processing, and she does a lot of outreach to students. Hey, happy to help you. I need some bills. And so it's not a long application, but it's got a lot of logic in it. So I don't know exactly how many questions there are total.
That's totally fair, but it's helpful even just for you to give us that image of a student literally taking the picture and then uploading that. Okay, yeah. Very, very helpful. Teresa, did you happen to find out how many questions it is? And it's okay if not, but I just wanted to check.
Yes, ma'am. So there's just basic information, like there's their basic personal information, and then questions to ask to determine, I guess, are basically if they're enrolled in FAFSA, if they're enrolled in the semester. So 1, 2, 3, 4 questions basically, other than their personal information.
Okay, good. Okay. Let's see. I see that Shelley said there's an online Jot form. Leslie said there's an online Google form. Have any of you looked to see what % of students who start the application finish the application? Is that something that you have been able to pull up to ensure that people who begin it actually finish it? Has anybody been able to take that look?
We haven't, but that would be great.
Okay. Okay. So Shelley, so that's something that you could do. Yeah. So that's a really important thing to do because, you know, what I'd recommend is that first you start by just, again, the very basic. If they started it, how many of them quit it without actually filing it? And then if you're able to, if, for example, the students have to log in order to do that application, then you might know something about them. Then you could begin to disaggregate that data a little bit, right? So my strongest recommendation is if you can, look to see whether men and women are starting and finishing the applications at the same rates. Not whether equal numbers of men and women apply, right? But even if they log on, do they get to the finish line at different rates? Because this is one of the big areas of our practice that we see big gender differences. Men are much less likely to actually get through the process. And that's true, by the way, particularly for men who are African-American or Latino. Okay, so something just to dig into. Then there's this time from application to decision. Somebody give me a sense, there's a lot of variation in here. So somebody who said, you know, we're really slow on that. What does that process look like right now? How do you get from application to decision? Is anybody be willing to share?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so for somebody who said, you know what, we're kind of slow on that one. What is that process of making the decision? How does it actually happen? What are you doing? Okay, so here's one of the things that we've seen. We've been doing about interviews with about 140, 145 colleges during the last year. And we noticed that institutions that tend to move more slowly there tend to engage more people in the decision. I don't think this should surprise anybody, right? Decisions that are made by committee or decisions that have to go through multiple reviews tend to move more slowly. Decisions that are automated, decisions that are made based on an algorithm, or decisions that default to yes rather than defaulting to no tend to go faster. Okay, and then I see that it looks like the biggest concern in terms of many people saying that they're moving a lot more slowly is in how you distribute the money. So let's get a sense of what you all are using in order to actually push money out the door. Once you're trying to get that money to students, what's the process? Would anybody be willing to speak to that? Is anybody using Venmo? Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I like the Venmo idea. We usually go through financial aid. We check with them to make sure any aid won't affect the student's package. And if we can, if it, you know, that's okay and they don't have a balance, then we prefer to put it on their student account.
Okay.
At this time, disbursement dates are only on Thursday.
Okay.
So if I approve a grant today, they're not going to get their funds until next Thursday, which is 10 days.
Okay, great. I really appreciate your candor on this one. So there's a couple of things that you just noted that I want to flag for folks. The first is that you have a standard timeline, right, when checks get cut. And so if you're using a check cutting system and you're using your standard approach and the timeline has not been adjusted for your emergency aid program, it is a major way in which the timelines get extended, right? Especially for the students who are unlucky and apply just after the last kind of time that the check was cut. The second thing that can increase a lot of the timing in here is this question of whether it's going to review by financial aid. And look, I totally understand why that review happens. And I understand why many institutions are still doing it. I do want to flag for you that with the federal HERF dollars, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, that review is not required. In fact, by federal law, the emergency aid being distributed through HERF does not count towards a student's estimated financial aid. All right, so if that review is happening, it might be happening for other kinds of emergency aid, for philanthropy, or it might be a decision that the institution has made at its own discretion. But I do want to clarify that by federal law, that's not required. Okay, and part of the reason is so that things can move faster. And the other part of the reason is that it's a recognition that that estimated financial aid calculation and the FAFSA are about a student's need at a very particular point in time, often 2 years ago, when the FAFSA tax data is collected, and isn't about their need in that particular moment for emergency aid. Okay, for those who are moving faster, how are you moving faster? What is your approach? If you think you're getting the money out the door quickly, what are you doing? Anybody? Okay, we'll continue on and we'll see what if folks want to share later. That's totally fine. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we find that on average these days, and this is contemporary data, this isn't like from a few years ago, which basically feels irrelevant right now. Institutions are taking an average of 14 days. And to be honest with you, I think that's really 14 business days, because the vast majority of folks like yourselves are reporting these things in terms of business days. The range is from 2 days, though, a real 2 days, up to 18 days. And in the 2-day case, it really is 7 days a week. The 2-day cases are rare, but they use technology. And so those examples tend to come from places like Dallas College, Compton College, and a few others that are using an app that allows them to process applications without the use of human beings in those applications, which means that they can operate 24/7. The 18 days uses committees. That's really where a lot of that is coming from. Okay, so that really does appear to explain most of the range. We find these practices and these ranges across the community colleges and across virtually every other sector. So it's not like only one type of college with one type of budget or this amount of student need or this amount of available aid is actually doing it faster or slower. Doesn't seem to be the case. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Colleges that tend to move faster tend to operate from a position that we would reflect as trusting students. That's not just like a fuzzy, touchy-feely kind of thing, right? It means, for example, that they tend not to ask a student to verify much, right? The idea there is the student says they have needs, so they have needs, so we move to respond to it. We do not ask for proof. In many cases, the only proof that's asked for is that the student's actually a student at the college, and that's quickly verified with a student ID. Colleges that move faster tend to do their outreach using all available possible ways. So I saw in some of the advanced feedback for today, people were asking about what else can you do besides putting the information on the website and sending it out through email. Well, the first thing is where on the website? And the answer should be everywhere, as many places as possible, and ideally as front and center as possible, right? The more clicks that a student has to make in order to go through to find the information, the less likely they are to find it. Just like you all. I mean, if I buried, if you were on Amazon, imagine that it was really hard for you to find the item that you were shopping for. You would give up and you wouldn't buy it. Right? So they make it really, really easy. In fact, they use an algorithm that recommends to you the kinds of things they think that you'll be looking for. Imagine if during the pandemic, there was a pop-up that said, do you need emergency aid? Popping up right on the front screen to prompt a student to be able to do that application. They are also tending to push this out on social media. Some people are afraid to push it on social media because they will get applications from non-students. Other institutions are seeing that as an opportunity, particularly because right now you can use your federal pandemic aid for non-students. You can use your student portion for people who used to be your students who left, and you can use your institutional portion if you so choose for non-students. to try to help their lives stabilize so that they could go to college if they wanted to. Another thing that colleges that move faster tend to do is find and eliminate red tape. I highly recommend a tape audit. Ask a student, pay a student to go through your emergency aid process in a piloting manner. And ask them to write down where they get tripped up, what slows them down, where they get confused, where they find frustrating, where they feel embarrassed, and have them share that with you. And the other thing is that institutions that tend to move faster tend to use multiple funding sources for their emergency aid. And what that looks like is all on the back end. That doesn't mean that at the front, let's say that I needed support. If I faced an application that said, do you meet these criteria, apply with this. If you meet these criteria, apply with this. And if you meet these criteria, apply with this. That's 3 different portals. That's going to slow me down. Right? Because now I got to figure out which portal to enter through. Rather than that, these schools use one common portal. And on the back end, based on who the student is and what criteria they have, they put the funds in on the back end. So if they qualify for federal funds, they use federal funds. If they qualify for philanthropy, they use philanthropy. And the student never sees that part. Now, Chris, you're absolutely right. Fear of compliance violations tends to slow the staff down. That's exactly right. And all of you live in that world. Everybody who's accepting Title IV money knows what a compliance violation looks like. And that is a big part of what is making it harder for institutions to learn how to effectively scale emergency aid and to actually do the work even when they know how. And I very much agree with you. And it's a problem that we name and that we are trying to advocate for addressing. Because if you don't feel safe using processes that will help your students, that by itself is a problem. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Angelina. Now, moving faster is often more equitable, and it really is. It is part of equity. But there are a couple of other things if you're interested in being able to leverage emergency aid to improve the equity of your impact. First, looking beyond FAFSA, by which I really mean looking beyond the expected family contribution. We've all been trained to think that Pell is the proxy for need. But about half of students not getting Pell deal with basic needs and security. About half. How can that be? Well, the first reason is that so many people find that they either don't have an expected family contribution because they couldn't FAFSA. And secondly, a huge number of people are finding that expected family contribution does not at all represent their financial resources. Okay. In fact, in some cases, Pell recipients have received or will receive more support because, for example, they're more eligible for things like SNAP. They're more eligible for things like the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and so on and so forth. And so it's actually the students who are in that great gray middle who don't qualify for programs who end up in worse shape and find that they're not eligible for much at all. Colleges that move more equitably also do not determine students' eligibility for emergency aid based on how many classes they're enrolled for. And that's because living expenses don't exactly get divided based on how many classes you're taking. We know that the Pell Grant already does that. It gives half the money to half-time students, assuming they can make up that money with work, but especially during the pandemic, that's not really happening. And then the last technique that is being used by schools that are moving more equitably is that they're not just giving out emergency aid once, they're giving out multiple payments. And that's very, very helpful. If you've done all this work to find out that a student needs the emergency help, it's worth not only giving them one payment, but giving it to them month after month. That's something that we do in the youth homelessness space that's particularly effective. It helps people to stabilize. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So based on all of those things, and maybe some things that I didn't talk about, I'm curious, what are your ideas now at this moment about ways to help make it easier for your students to get emergency aid? Good. So the first big category of things that I'm seeing here is to advertise, advertise, advertise. I can't say how much I have come to believe that basically strategic communications and marketing are a grossly underutilized tool in higher ed. I don't know how many of you saw it, but we released a study just last week from the Hope Center based at one of your colleges. And it was a study that looked at this question of whether we could improve utilization of an already popular support. This college has a basic needs center, and it seemed like it was really well used. But we had concerns that even what looks like well used was still not as well used as it could be. And so we tested whether just sending students an email once a month, one email a month, that said, you know, dear Angelina, you might be struggling with this challenge in college. Many students are. And if that's happening to you, we want you to go to this basic needs center. One email a month. We increased the rate of use of that basic needs center from 25% to 66%. And in turn, it helped the students academically. So that advertising could very well pay off. I see advertising repeatedly. Yes, please. Emergencies can strike at any moment. A student might think I'm okay right now. The pandemic's not, really badly affecting me. And that could turn around in a couple of weeks. I see one of you noting a less intrusive application process, or an application process that doesn't rely on showing need through a bill. Let me give you a quick example of why that might be helpful. Let's think about childcare. Right? About 40 to 45% of your students have a child of their own, and many others don't have a child of their own, but they're providing care for a child. And childcare bills are a major reason that people get into financial emergencies. But there often aren't actual bills from childcare, right? Friends and family provide childcare, and you still have to pay them. But they can't produce a bill with an account number. Okay, and there's a lot of those things going on in the informal economy that are not bad things. It's great to have a sister or an aunt or a cousin who you can give a little money to take care of your kid. But it's hard if you're not able to then get them paid. I'm really interested in this idea that there are recommendations from faculty or staff. I want to speak to that for just a moment. It's great to engage your faculty and staff in helping find students who need support. But if they are the arbiters of whether or not students get support, then you're going to increasingly only support the students who are lucky enough to have those connections, or who have presented themselves in ways to your faculty and staff that make them think that these are worthwhile cases. And I want you to think for a moment about all of our inherent biases that we possess as we look at people, and especially people dealing with poverty, and who might be judged as if they are not maybe as in need, or maybe not as deserving. The 24-hour processing center, absolutely, if you can figure out a way. People have come up with all kinds of creative solutions. One of those things is to just designate a person whose judgment you trust and empower them to make the decisions. And maybe you switch that off. Maybe that changes week by week, or maybe you have a rubric for making the decision. Okay. And yes, outreach to people who have never applied without making any assumption about why they haven't applied, to encourage them. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. I want to say a few words about HERF before we finish up. So I really hope, and I understand that throughout your state, HERF has been very, very challenging. HERF really is an opportunity, and this is how I want you to think about it. HERF is an opportunity to demonstrate to the federal government that it needs to do better with regard to financial aid. Financial aid is an incredibly bureaucratic, slow-moving process that is essential to the operations of your institutions and essential to your students' lives, but it also just piles on the administrative burden. And Congress has created a path to a different kind of emergency aid, or a different kind of financial aid. And Congress is assessing whether or not it's worth doing through these trials. So HERF 3 is the third go around. And they are providing you with a lot of flexibility. In contrast to the CARES Act, you can give this money to almost anyone. And I really mean that, as I said earlier. People don't even have to be enrolled. They could be high school students who are dual enrolled. Okay, they can be no longer enrolled. They can be undocumented. They can be international. They can be former foster youth. They can be anybody. So think big. It's a lot of money. Is it enough money? No. But it's a lot more money than we've ever had for emergency aid, and it is non-taxable. It does not count for a student's estimated financial aid. It does not count against their aid eligibility for the next year, but it is time limited. These funds are supposed to be spent by the end of 2022. They are offering no-cost extensions for a year. So if you are involved in that planning, you should be able to think about using some of it for a longer period of time. But I would also say Congress is not going to authorize any more money until this money is spent. And that's become very, very clear. So as the pandemic continues to drag on and there still continues to be need for emergency aid, I know it's a catch-22. We want to avoid a cliff, all this magic money disappearing, but in part we have to spend it in order to get more money behind it. They're considering bills to make emergency aid legislation to make it permanent, but they're looking for evidence that the colleges actually needed this money. Next slide. So have any of you considered doing these things? I want to just take a quick pulse check, and we will send you more information in the coming weeks about these strategies. Have you considered doing multiple payments to students to help them with maintaining and staying out of homelessness, for example? Have you moved beyond expected family contribution to assess need? And have you used your dollars to support students returning to college? Okay, so we've only got a handful of responses here. It looks like some of you have thought about doing some of these things. Moving beyond expected family contribution to assess need is the #1 thing I'd ask you to think about, particularly since the federal guidance really requires it. According to the federal guidance, you're not supposed to only use expected family contribution to determine need. You can do more than one thing, but you can't only do one. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Angelina, so that people can register questions. Go ahead and please type in any remaining questions for today. And I will get back to you personally. I will write out answers to all of these and send them to you afterwards. We're going to be sending, following this session, we're going to be equipping the coaches with a bunch of additional resources. We have 4 reports coming out all about new findings on emergency aid. They're all coming out on the 27th. We're going to have a special webinar about that. We'll send you that information to be a detailed look at all of the data I've been describing. We have a new policy brief coming out with ideas for how to use your HERF dollars. Okay. We also have a special look at the use of emergency aid for parenting students. These can be used to drive conversations and also to stimulate new ideas. If you do have a question, please let me know. And as Angelina said, I would really appreciate you also doing the short evaluation before you leave so that we can know how we can improve and continue to support you in this work. I believe that this is one of the most important practices that we can invest on improving, because no matter whether there's another pandemic or whether it's more disasters or tornadoes, hurricanes, the need for emergency relief is not going away. Thanks all of you for having me today. It was great to be with you.